So in the last couple classes, we've been looking at the importance of personhood for the abortion debate. And what we've said is that this seems like a very critical issue. If someone is a person, then they have a right to life. And if they have a right to life, then there are very few things that would justify ending their life. On the other hand, if something lacks a right to life, then the conditions under which we can terminate their existence are much less stringent than if they were a person. As I've said, only people have a right to life, and all people have a right to life. And since this is a very important question for the abortion debate, what we need to do is figure out, is the fetus a person, yes or no? And in pursuing this question, what we're going to be trying to do is to unpack what we call criteria for persons, or criteria for personhood. And criteria are basically those defining characteristics, what defines something as a particular type of thing. Just as a little terminological note, a criteria is plural, a criterion is singular. So that's it's not very important, but it's something noteworthy when you're using this terminology. You say criteria when you're talking about multiple characteristics or multiple features of something, whereas you talk about criterion when you're talking about one particular feature, the defining features. And in this case, when we say we're looking for criteria of personhood, we're basically just asking, what are the feature or features that determine whether or not something is a person, that is, whether or not it has a right to life. And it'd be interesting, I wish I could actually ask all of you and you could give me your already established opinions about this, but my guess is that what we'd find is that if we were trying to actually provide criteria for personhood, if I said, what is the feature or features that make something a person, we might derive very different answers. What we see so far is that, as I said, for Kant, something is a person if they have free will. They can exercise free will. Someone like Aristotle said, what makes you a person is the use of reason. And there are a lot of other theories here as well. And I don't want to actually provide any kind of definition up front because I feel like doing that is going to inevitably involve some form of question begging, and I don't think it would be satisfactory to all parties involved. So what I want to do, and this is kind of my general strategy for a good number of things, is when I'm trying to develop criteria, if it's of persons or if it's of pretty much anything, I always think it's a good methodology to begin with the clear cases and keep those firmly in mind, the clear cases. And in this case, what we're going to be asking, or what I'm going to be asking you, is whether or not certain cases that I provide are clear cases of persons. And I'm going to give you a wide variety of examples, and I hope none of you are offended by any of these. But it's really important that when you're considering clear cases of anything that you're trying to develop criteria for, that you don't just consider the obvious ones, so to speak, but you look for all various kinds. So here's a case of something or someone who might be a possible person, a 21-year-old perfectly healthy college student. What I want you to ask yourself is, does someone who's 21 years of age and they're in perfectly good health, and let's say they're in college, would they be classified as a person, as someone who, in this case, keep in mind, has a right to life? And I've asked people in face-to-face classes this many, many times. Everybody always says yes. And it's obvious. If you said no, I think you'd be pulling my leg. I don't think you'd be being honest. Yeah, of course, someone who's 21 years old, they're perfectly healthy, they have a right to life. They are a person in the technical sense in which we're using person. How about some random bushman, uneducated guy who lives in a village somewhere, in Africa, or maybe like an aborigine in Australia? Actually, I was reading about a group of people who live in Peru who still hunt with like wooden spears, and it's illegal to actually interfere with their culture at all. The Peruvian government wants to keep them isolated from the rest of the world. They just wear animal skins. And I'm not talking, 200 years ago. I'm talking right now. They still act this way. Would you consider them persons? These individuals, would they have a right to life? And again, I always ask people this, and the answer is obviously yes. Your level of education is irrelevant. No matter how primitive your customs might be, those are irrelevant. You'd still be a person, and you'd have a right to life. What about a one-day-old baby? Would a one-day-old baby have a right to life? And I think, at least intuitively, most everybody I've ever asked, in fact, has said, yes, a one-day-old baby, of course, has a right to life. What about a 30-year-old who's paralyzed? Let's say from the neck down, they can't move and they're confined to a bed. Are they a person? Yes, they're a person, of course. How about a child with Down syndrome? Again, I would say a child with Down syndrome does have a right to life. How about a 94-year-old grandmother suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's? Would she be a person? Does she have a right to life? Yes, once again, yes. All right, the next one is going to be a little bit, I don't know, weird, but that's just the way it is. How about if we encountered an alien visitor, like Mr. Spock from Star Trek? There's a new Star Trek movie coming out. Hope all of you go see it. I can't exactly promise you extra credit, but if you went to see it, and you let me know that you'd seen it and you offered some kind of proof, it would certainly curry favor in my eyes. But anyways, I digress. But let's suppose like Mr. Spock or Yoda or some alien visitor came down. Would they be a person? And it might seem a little weird at first, but the question I'm asking here is not are they a human being, but do they have a right to life? Would we have to give them and grant them a right to life? And again, the answer seems yes, I think. And so we look at these examples, and there's a good reason I offer these examples is because they're very, very different from one another. Like a 21-year-old healthy college student, well, her level of education is going to be very different than some person from a primitive society. Be very different. And the mental capacities even of a 21-year-old are going to be very different than the mental capacities of a one-day-old baby. Or think about, we might think, well, but the baby has a potential to develop into such and such. Yeah, but look at a child with Down syndrome. Their potential to develop any further rational capacities are extremely limited. And a 94-year-old grandmother, her potential is very, very limited, and her memory is very, very limited. So we look at all these things and we see that all these listed here in the examples are very different in terms of education, and very different in terms of mental capabilities, even species, if you are willing to grant my alien visitor one. In this one, their genetics would be completely different. And so, yet all of these, I think we would want to describe as being persons in this moral sense. And when we're asking about what are the criteria for personhood, what we're asking is, what is the common feature that they share? What's the thread that runs through these that grants them a right to life? That's the question we're trying to ask. And I want to just, if you'll just work with me here for a moment, digress a little bit from the immediate concern about abortion and try to let you know that this issue here about personhood is actually a much larger issue than just a debate about abortion. In fact, this discussion of personhood influences and comes up in a lot of other philosophical conversations. For instance, a lot of times when we talk about animals and animal rights, a number of animal rights activists try to argue that certain great apes are, in fact, persons. There is a project known as the Great Ape Project. And in this Great Ape Project, what they're trying to do is get chimpanzees and other types of primates declared to have the status of persons. In fact, I think it was in Argentina just a couple years ago, orangutans were declared to be legal persons. And some of you might hear this and think, this is insanity. Of course, a chimpanzee isn't a person. But from their point of view, what they say is well, look, what makes you a person is the possession of certain kinds of mental capabilities, that you can think and reason and engage in these kinds of mental capabilities. And the reality is the mental life of an adult chimp is actually much more sophisticated than that of human beings with severe cases of Down syndrome. I know that sounds really, really cruel to say, but it's the truth. In fact, male chimps, not male, I'm sorry, I meant to say adult chimps, they display intelligence on a par with roughly a 5-year-old child. It's really interesting because there have been a number of intelligence studies done on chimpanzees and other kinds of primates, and what has been determined is, number one, they're extremely intelligent. They can engage in problem solving, they can use tools, and not just basic problem solving, but complex problem solving. I say complex, relatively complex. I mean, they're not going to be splitting the atom or programming a computer or anything. But here's an example. So there was one, they were trying to test the intelligence of a chimpanzee, and what ended up happening, or the way the test was performed is they suspended a banana from the ceiling of a rather high room, or the high ceiling of a room. And I think the ceiling was clearly out of reach. The chimp couldn't jump and get it. It was probably 10 feet or 15 feet tall. And then they laid boxes out in the room. And I was thinking, okay, the chimp's going to take a box and throw it at it and try to knock it down. But what the chimp did is he stacked the boxes to create a set of stairs. And then he climbed up the set of stairs and he took the banana down. That's really intelligent. I mean, honestly, in my mind, I was thinking, oh, get a box and jump off of it, and then you could grab it. I didn't even think about, building a structure so that you could get up there easily without breaking your neck. It's interesting, too, because chimps display an extremely rich emotional lives. They display a lot of types of emotions that human beings do, like even more complex ones like jealousy, rage, envy. These kinds of emotions are displayed in chimpanzees. It's kind of interesting too because chimpanzees can actually learn sign language. They can be taught sign language. And, you might think, okay, well, they're just parroting this. They don't really understand what they're doing. It's kind of monkey see, monkey do type thing. And so this is something that actually scientists worried about for a number of years. They actually wondered, hey, did the chimps really and truly understand signs that they're using? Well, the display that you have true comprehension is that you can use the language in novel ways, that you're not just stuck with the handful of signs that you've been given, that maybe you can combine them in different ways to show that you really do have comprehension. And so there have been many cases of chimps that would use their language, their limited sign language, to form new words to describe something they were experiencing. So, for instance, there was this just one that comes to mind, a chimpanzee that had been taught sign language. He had watermelon for the first time, never had it. But he didn't have a sign for watermelon. So what he did is he took his sign for sweet and drink, and he combined them to describe what it was he was having, a sweet drink. Which, even in our description of it, it's water, right? Watermelon, which watermelon, water and drink. I mean, it's our words are very similar. I mean, our word, actually, watermelon is just a combination of two other words, which is exactly what this particular chimp was doing. Furthermore, this is kind of interesting too, is we know that chimps, at least at a certain level, become self-aware. And what it means to be self-aware, it's kind of hard to explain, but basically you recognize yourself as yourself. And this is a concept that's really hard to test in other creatures. And so what scientists have done is they've tried to develop what's called the mirror test, which basically they just take an animal and they put it in front of a mirror and see if it can recognize its own image. And I don't know if you've ever seen, but sometimes you put a dog in front of a mirror and they'll see it and they'll think they're looking at another dog and they'll bark at it. And so the dog doesn't recognize that it's looking at its own image. But chimpanzees actually, once they get to a certain age, You put them in front of the mirror, and they look in the mirror, and then they start to groom themselves, and they recognize that they're looking at themselves in the mirror. Interestingly, human beings don't display this behavior until around age 2 or so. So everything I just told you, the chimps are intelligent, they have a rich emotional lives, they can learn language, again, they're self-aware. You hear all of this and you say, wow, does this thing deserve to have certain kinds of rights? Does it deserve to be treated with a certain level of dignity and respect? Because its mental capabilities are equal to that, and in many cases superior to that of some humans whom we do grant a right to life. So this is what people who are animal rights activists, they argue. It's an interesting argument, and I don't think it's one that can be so easily dismissed. But again, this comes down to their understanding of what a person is. The case of personhood is also really important when we turn to cases that involve certain kind of medical decisions that people reach. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the case of Terry Schiavo. Terry Schiavo was a young woman from Florida, and she ended up having oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank here. I want to say a heart attack, and she lost oxygen to her brain. And as a result of this, she was reduced. You can see here, she was a young, pretty healthy woman. She was reduced from this state to a state where she was declared to be incompetent. And in this state, she couldn't talk. She couldn't eat or move. She basically laid in her bed, and she would sometimes make groans. She would sometimes, if you caressed her, she would sometimes indicate that, maybe she liked it with a groan. She might, groan when certain people came in the room that she recognized. But for all intents and purposes, she was a vegetable. And this raises an interesting question. Is she still a person at this point? Given her deteriorated state, given her total and permanent loss of any kind of higher order functions, is she a person? And if you say yes, then why not say the chimpanzee was? Because, again, adult chimpanzees, their mental lives are vastly superior to that of Schiavo's. This is, again, it's a disputed case. Earlier we were looking at clear cases of persons. This one is one that is disputed. I just want to give you a couple more, again, trying to emphasize here, some of these disputed cases of personhood. But here's yet another one. Some children are unfortunately born with a condition known as anencephaly. And basically, anencephaly is when a child is born without a brain and only a brain stem. And as a result of that condition, they can't feel, they can't see, they can't hear. They cannot really interact with their environment in any kind of way whatsoever. And typically they'll die within a couple of days. And I want you to ask yourself, is this a person? Someone who lacks any kind of higher order brain function and will never have any kind. And, some of you might be looking at the image here and you may be thinking, well, yeah, look at it. It looks very much like a person. I'm going to show you an image that's a closer up one, and it's disturbing. I'm just going to let you know it's a disturbing image, but you need to see it. So here's what it looks like up close. And the question here is this really a person? At that point, I'll just go ahead and remove it because I know some people get bothered by it. Someone who has no ability whatsoever. I mean, and this isn't maybe they could. No, it will not happen. They do not have a brain. Some cases they have maybe like a slight bit more brain. I think the longest a child with anencephaly has ever lived has been 2 years, but they had a greater portion of their brain. But the more extreme cases, they have no brain. It's just a brain stem. And so they can't feel, hear, taste, nothing. Nothing. Is that a person if you can't demonstrate any kind of person-like qualities? Well, I don't have an answer for you, but that's a disputed case. All right, this one, I know some of you are going to laugh, but this is actually an interesting question that comes up in the field of a philosophy of mind, is whether or not a machine could ever be a person. If a machine could actually, should have a right to life if it reached a certain level of mental capabilities. And you might ask yourself, some of you might be thinking, oh no, a machine couldn't because we created it. Okay, well, we create people too, don't we? I mean, that's what happens when you put the Vandross on, right? You let the lights down low. So what's the difference here if we create it in a laboratory or we create it in a bedroom? Does something just have to have biology? Is that what's required in order to be a person, that you have to be organic? Why couldn't something have a completely different structure, be made of metal and wires as opposed to cells and blood? Why is one required for personhood over the other? What if we could develop a machine that reached a certain level of self-awareness and consciousness, and they could understand what was around them? They could think and feel. What if we did develop that? Would we not have to say that it's a person and it deserves a right to life? And you might think, oh no, again, this is silly, but think about some of the movies you've seen. For instance, like Wall-E. Or maybe you've seen I, Robot. And in these movies, it's not unbelievable. It's not crazy to think that the machines in the movie are not just machines. When you watch a movie like Wall-E, you don't think it's just a toaster oven. You feel sympathy for it. You think Wall-E, you kind of think of it like a person. Or an I, Robot. For me, I certainly thought of Sonny as a person. I didn't think of it as just a machine, as just a car. It seemed like it had feelings and it could reason and think and it was aware of itself. And so with all that being said, again, some people would argue that if a machine could be developed to a sufficient level of complexity, that it too might deserve to be considered in the class of people. And so I'm basically going through these cases just to show you more or less that this topic and debate about personhood is not limited to just this debate about abortion. It's actually a very significant debate that influences and comes up in a lot of different areas. It'd be interesting if we had time, we could talk about these. Unfortunately, we don't. And so we're going to turn back to what is our immediate concern, and that, of course, is the debate about abortion and whether or not the fetus is, in fact, a person. And it's with this question in mind that we're going to turn to in the next video lecture, looking at the positions and arguments of both John Noonan and Marianne Warren. And what we're going to see is that John Noonan offers an argument for the effect that a fetus is a person, whereas Marianne Warren, she argues that the fetus is not a person.